Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, so if you can find your seats. So, everyone who has any relationship to Columbia Journalism School or Columbia at all knows that there's very little distance between this institution and world events and world affairs. In this case, that's literally true. But in some ways, it's fitting that we are a journalism school and we are in the midst of this. One of the things that happened earlier today is that as all the protests have been going on, I saw students outside with their cameras, with their microphones, doing the work of journalism just as they should. And so I say all that to say that we have a little bit more ambient sound than we traditionally would anticipate at a memorial, but it is news nonetheless, and so somehow fitting. Tonight we gather to remember and celebrate the life of Professor Dick Wald, a man who left an indelible mark on the world of journalism and this very institution. Mr. Wald's career was a testament to his passion for storytelling. From print media to navigating the fast-paced world of network news at ABC and NBC, he ensured that news, under his leadership, met the highest journalistic standards. But his dedication extended far beyond print and broadcast journalism. He chose to share his experience and expertise with a new generation, becoming a cherished faculty member here at the J School. Many of you knew Dick Wald as a professor, a colleague, or a friend. Perhaps you remember his sharp wit, his unwavering support, or the infectious enthusiasm he brought to every classroom. Tonight, we celebrate all of who he was. We honor the journalist who informed the world, the educator who empowered future voices, and the individual who touched the lives of so many. I also want to take this moment to acknowledge his family and friends who are here tonight. Your presence means the world. And now I ask that you direct your attention to the heartfelt video tribute that was created and produced by Rebecca Castillo and Lauren Mack, both from the class of 2006 and two of Professor Wald's former students.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. This is the disjointed voice of Brian Williams, and we're all here to remember our friend Dick Wald. Richard C. Wald was born on March 19, 1930, on 110th Street in Manhattan. Dick Wald, later known as RCW on his legendary corporate memoranda, went to Stuyvesant High School on 15th Street, then went on to Columbia College on 116th Street.
In college, I became a stringer for the New York Herald Tribune when I was in my senior year, and I just have been in the news business ever since.
Wald left the island of Manhattan briefly to go to college in England. He came to his senses, returned to New York, and worked for the Herald Tribune on 41st Street, followed by Whitney Communications on 49th Street. He left newspapers entirely and worked at NBC News on 48th Street and ABC News on 66th Street, then worked on 116th Street for good measure. He left the island again as a foreign correspondent for 4 years and for brief sojourns in Washington at the Washington Post, In L.A. for the Times-Mirror Corporation. He traveled occasionally for the Knight Fellowships in Journalism at Stanford. He was named a vice president of NBC News in 1968 and was NBC News president himself from 1973 to 1977, where, among other things, he installed Tom Brokaw and Jane Pauley as Today Show hosts. Explaining why he left print journalism and joined NBC News in the late 1960s, he often said, quote, "I didn't leave newspapers. Newspapers left me." While still the president of NBC News, Wald foresaw the likelihood of an all-news network back in 1976, 4 full years before Ted Turner created CNN. When Wald joined ABC News as senior vice president in 1978, it was being remade by Roone Arledge, who had built his reputation in sports broadcasting. Wald and Arledge, classmates at Columbia College, built up the news division, with Wald as chief overseer of the network's news programming, including its flagship, World News Tonight. The duo lured the anchor David Brinkley from NBC News to host what would become the popular Sunday morning program This Week with David Brinkley. During his tenure at ABC News, Dick Wald also gave the network's celebrated late-night news program Nightline its name. With a team that included Peter Jennings, Diane Sawyer, Barbara Walters, and Ted Koppel, Roone Arledge got his Mount Rushmore, and ABC News rose to the top of the broadcast network news divisions at the height of their power, before their influence was reduced by 24-hour cable news, the internet, and the hateful phone so many of us are currently addicted to. After retiring from ABC News in 1999, Dick Wald started teaching journalism at Columbia Journalism School. During his time at Columbia, Professor Wald taught Reporting and Writing 1, National Affairs Reporting, and Critical Issues. If you didn't have the chance to have a seat at the conference table for National Affairs Reporting, here's what it was like in Dick Wald's own words from the syllabus, spring of 2007. Quote, "We are to think of ourselves as the New York bureau of a West Coast publication. What we write, what we look for, has to be of interest to people who do not know our locality and don't give much of a damn what happens on an everyday basis in the Bronx. We will look for trends and wider understandings in the news. We will try to use both our feet and our brains when reporting. Each week I will bring in someone to speak to a topic of interest. You will interview him or her. Management reserves the right to change guests with proper notice." Well, the guest list was a who's who of the journalism world. All of the greats, Charlie Gibson, Jimmy Breslin, Barbara Walters, Tom Wolfe, and Gail Sheehy, were there among the guests, and there was always a mystery guest. The guest list once included yours truly. I'm certain someone important had to cancel, and Dick was too polite to tell me. The semester concluded with no guest unless, quote, "we want someone special. Eat wonton soup or a champagne toast. Tell Professor Wald how class could be better next year." Then there was his class on critical issues. Each week he delivered a sermon to a packed lecture hall.
And so what is the most critical issue? I will now tell you. It is you. You cannot solve any of these problems unless you understand what you are doing, unless you can make the distinctions, unless you can think of what are the ramifications of what I am about to do. Should I do this? Can I do this? This course cannot teach you the answers. It can teach you a way of thinking about the problems. And that way of thinking, if you can come to it, is something you keep learning all your life. I do not know the answers to many of the questions that we raise in this class, but I know what the questions are. I share the questions with you, but you will make all those changes. You will move on.
And move on they all did.
I'm James Ford, reporter at Pix 11 News, and graduate of the class of 2001 and student of Dick Wald. In fact, I was thinking of Dick Wald yesterday because I did the thing that I took away from his class. He said, always give everyone involved in the story their best shot. So we interviewed two people on different sides of one issue, and Dick, I did exactly as instructed. Thank you for living on through the work that I am lucky to do. I miss you.
My name is Brittany Logan, and I was really fortunate to have been a student of Professor Wald's. I remain eternally grateful to him for his humor, for his honesty, for his mentorship.
Embodied thoughts, that is the big one that I remember. May the values that he embodied, may they live on through us and through our work and through the people whom we teach.
We lost Dick Wald on May 13th of 2022. His wife of 67 years, Edith, died in 2021. Dick Wald is survived by his 3 children, Elizabeth, Jonathan, and Matthew, 7 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandson. Additionally, he leaves behind all those of us who admired him and loved him.
And so, I thank you for your attendance, for your viewing of our guests, and for helping me. I wish you all a great career. I hope you are all even better than I think you are. And it is now time for you to go away.
Good evening. I'm Professor June Cross, and I'm the current Fred Friendly Professor of Media and Society. Dick Wald and I started teaching here this same year, only he had vastly more experience than I did. When I think of him now, the adjectives that come to mind are debonair and courtly. Dick was a tall, impeccably dressed gentleman who could coin quips better than most comics I knew. But he also required the reporters and students in his class to use their minds as well as their feet in pursuit of a story. He demanded excellence in written English. Sometimes, as I listened to him recount stories from his career, I would marvel at the charmed life he seemed to have led. What are the chances that 4 roommates from Columbia would grow up to become the heads of the New York Times, ABC News, NBC News, and president of PBS? Dick had a charmed life, is what I thought. Dick began his career a generation after Fred Friendly started making documentaries for CBS Reports, so I'm sure it was an honor for him to be named the first Fred Friendly Professor of Media and Society. Fred Friendly had been a force in our industry. He and his colleague, Edward R. Murrow, had nearly single-handedly ended the McCarthy era in the United States, in which alleged communists were prosecuted, many of whom had only attended one meeting or had a relative who had once gone to a meeting. A New Yorker profile about Fred Friendly referred to him and his sidekick, Edward R. Murrow, as the captain and the engine room, Murrow being the captain and Friendly being the guy who was in the engine room driving the ship forward. I met Fred after he had left CBS during the time in which he was running a series of programs known as the Fred Friendly Seminars, which were deep explorations into public policies and urgent issues facing the public. These seminars ran for over 30 years, and they were all publicized on PBS. I was even on one of them. I never thought I would grow up to become a Fred Friendly professor myself. The seminars were long-formed explorations featuring not 2 or 3 points of view, but more like 10 or 12. I don't know if it would even be possible to do what Fred Friendly did today, but I do know that Dick Wald, through his example and his teaching, carried the torch of those examples for the students who cherished his wisdom.
Hi, everybody. I'm Betsy West, and I am the Fred Friendly Professor Emerita here at the Journalism School. Dick Wald was my faculty colleague for over a decade, but before that, he was my boss. Actually, he was my boss's boss, an eminence on the very dreaded 5th floor of ABC News, where he was the vice president, or I guess the senior vice president of standards and practices. Despite his lofty position and his journalistic pedigree, Dick put me on an equal footing. The first time we met was over the phone in 1980 during ABC's live coverage of the Democratic National Convention in New York. I was a newly hired producer, nervously but officiously answering the phones in the very noisy TV1 control room. Betsy West, I barked into the receiver. There was a pause, then an almost bemused response. Betsy West. West, he said. This is Wald. And that became his standard greeting for me. Of all the scary people on the 5th floor, Dick was the most approachable and had the best dry sense of humor. It never failed him, even when he was enforcing his very tough job keeping the troops on the ethical straight and narrow. Once, a producer working for me became a tad overzealous, trying to obtain an interview, knocking on the front door, and refusing to leave when told to do so. As a result, ABC was looking at a 6-figure lawsuit for trespassing. In his typically dry and direct way, Dick remarked, "You can't just go around butting into people's lives every time you want a good soundbite." He was a stickler for accuracy. Long before journalists were under assault from both the right and the left, Dick understood that our best defense was the truth. The actual truth, not truthiness, but the real, verifiable thing. He cared deeply about our profession and the most important role that we play in American democracy. But for someone who the New York Times called a defining figure in 20th century journalism, he was remarkably modest. We became friends, as much as your boss can be a friend. We weren't in regular touch after I left ABC for an executive job overseeing 60 Minutes at CBS News. But 6 years later, Dick was one of the first people who called me on the day in January of 2005 when I was ignominiously asked to leave the company. 60 Minutes had made a giant mistake in a story about then President George W. Bush, a mistake not really of my making, but definitely on my watch. The resulting scandal had become a political liability for CBS, and heads had to roll. I was cleaning out my desk when the phone rings. "West," he says, "this is Wald." I held my breath, waiting for Dick's bon mot, the pithy observation about what went wrong, the ethical lesson. But no. "You've been screwed," Dick said. "You're going to need something to do. Why don't you come work at Columbia?" Dick's generous impulse and support led to a huge and wonderful turning point in my life for which I am forever grateful. Once we were colleagues, we did become friends. I was always happy to see him stroll into the faculty meetings with what looked like a bespoke jacket from Jermyn Street in London, maybe a habit he picked up from his days as a foreign correspondent. Anyway, he was, as June said, dapper, old world, really, with his handkerchief in place, definitely the best-dressed faculty member at the J School, though that's not really a hard bar. I had the pleasure of watching him in action in the classroom a few times. His students adored him, and so did the jurors on the DuPont-Columbia board, which he chaired with great efficiency and remarkable tact. Dick was a guardian of decency, civility, and high moral standards, all qualities we could use more of today. We became even closer friends after we both retired from teaching. My husband Orrin and I had a memorable dinner with Dick and his wonderful wife Edith at the Century Club. After Edith's health deteriorated and he became her primary caregiver, he was direct about the challenge they were facing, but I never once heard him complain. When he could get into the city, we would have lunch, and he'd give me his take on the state of the news. He had such a worldly perspective, grounded in his Columbia and Cambridge educations, and, of course, his very prodigious reading habits. His insights always transcended the latest news scandal. After Edith died and after COVID had abated, we had a rollicking reunion lunch at the Century Club, gossiping about the media and about his plans for the future. Made me move into the city, do more writing. By the way, his wit translated to the page. You should really check out Dick's darkly hilarious New York Times essay about ordering a casket for his dying mother. At the Century Club that afternoon, we stayed well past the requisite dessert, literally the only people left in the dining room at 3 o'clock. The weather outside was chilly, and I bundled up as we left, but Dick wasn't wearing an overcoat. After we said our by now really affectionate goodbyes, I caught a glimpse of him striding east toward Grand Central, upright in his elegant cashmere jacket, pocket handkerchief in place. I sure miss him.
Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, June. Thank you, Jelani. My name is John Martin. I was an ABC News correspondent for about 25 years. And I just want to say thank you for inviting me to remember Dick Wald. He was a very special person. I met Dick one day in 1978 in an editing room at ABC News on West 66th Street. I was a relatively new correspondent assigned to help write and narrate a documentary. Dick was a relatively new senior vice president, as Betsy described, and he was assigned by Rune Arledge to make sure we did a good job. Dick was terrific. He was calm, he was careful, he was thorough, and he was thoughtful. Our program was called The Politics of Torture. We wanted to point out that, yes, Jimmy Carter had raised the level of world awareness of human rights, but for reasons of national security and economic strength, the United States was still supporting regimes which practiced brutality and torture against political opponents. Dick and I both thought we did a pretty good job, but the New York Times TV critic called our program, quote, resolutely simple-minded. So what could we do? We simply skipped the Emmy Awards that year, and they skipped us. Fast forward 25 years. When I retired from ABC News, Dick invited me to campus and introduced me to a committee that decided I was qualified to teach here. I don't think Dick knew that in the 1930s, my grandmother, an Irish immigrant, lived in the neighborhood and mopped floors here with my mother. So I was now going to teach at the place my grandmother and mother mopped floors. And Dick and I were both teaching seminars, and if any of you have taught them, you know how important it is to have good guest speakers. Betsy mentioned that. You want to really activate the seminar with people from the real world. And I was pretty smugly doing things like getting, let's see, what did I get? The first one. This was also a time when the 6 most terrifying words in the English language were, Mike Wallace is on the phone. Mike was a friend, and would you believe it, he volunteered to come and talk to my class, which I was so grateful for. Janet Reno, who had been Attorney General, came and answered all our questions. Wonderful. And Daniel Ellsberg wrote a book in I think it was about 2003 or 4, called Secrets, in which he described how and why he leaked the Pentagon Papers, and he came to class and took all our questions. He was a great, just a great catch, I guess you'd say, but very special man. Now, Dick and I were not competing, you have to understand, but we certainly were watching out for who went to whose class and so on. And so, not to be outdone, Dick invited a special friend of his to come, and he invited our class to come in and question him along with his class, which was very gracious of him. So who was the special friend? I've got it right down here, and it's Henry Kissinger, the only Secretary of State to simultaneously be Director of National Security. And he came a couple of times, and I'm just so grateful to Dick for what he did. And I'm just fascinated by how he might have come to be a special friend of Henry Kissinger. And if anybody here knows it and wants to explain it, it'd be great to hear it. Finally, my favorite Dick Wald story was the one he told at Roone Arledge's funeral. On his first day as a student at Columbia, Dick said, he found himself in a large hall where freshmen were lining up in alphabetized lines, registering for classes. So Dick walked in and walked to the back of his line and started talking to the guy at the end of it. And after a few minutes, he said, "So, what's your name?" Roone Arledge, came the voice back. And Dick said, "Wait a minute, you're in the wrong line. Your line is over there." Roone said, I see that line. I don't like that line. There are too many people. I like this line. It was right then that Dick said, we realized what a great big pain in the ass he was going to be. A pain in the ass, yes, but with Dick at his side, the two of them just raised the level of broadcast journalism. You saw that wonderful group of people in the film that Jelani put up. It became the most important and the best run news organization of its kind at the time. And I'm just grateful to have been able to be part of it. Thank you very much.
You know, maybe I'm just old-fashioned, but I could never quite get around to calling him Dick. He was always just Professor Wald. As a student, as a graduate, as a correspondent on the front lines covering war zones at ABC and CNN, it was always Professor Wald. I still remember those legendary digits, RCW25 at columbia.edu. It was like an email version of a bat phone whenever I needed advice. And he was always there to give it. I had the privilege, like many students, of spending an entire year with Professor Wald as my master's advisor. And like any proper journalism student can tell you, our class thought we were hot shit. I spent a year investigating extremism in the US prison system, and I thought nobody could touch me until the day I showed up for an interview at our main subject's home, who'd agreed to an exclusive. And he held out his hand and he said, "Mohammed, nice to meet you. The Wall Street Journal just left." Those are the words that no journalist should ever be forced to hear in their life. We were devastated. And the first call that we made when we got in trouble, and we did get in trouble, was to Professor Wald. 24 hours later, we were sitting in the offices of ABC's investigative unit with Brian Ross, and they were putting us on their payroll. It was thanks to one phone call from Professor Wald. So not only did he get me my first job, technically, in journalism, he also taught me the greatest line that I've heard, and I quote, "Screw the Wall Street Journal." It was the first time for me and many others that have been his students that we felt like we had a professor who was on our side, who was there to help us and knew we would make mistakes, but would cover our tracks if we did. I happen to be Canadian, by the way, and one day I was sitting in his office and Professor Wald told me, he said, "Mohammed, I could see you sitting in a chair one day that's currently occupied by another Canadian journalist by the name of Peter Jennings, who every Canadian journalist look up to." Now, this was right after 9/11, when there was nobody on television that looked like me or sounded like me, and let alone had a name Mohammed. Sure enough, 10 years later, after one of my foreign reporting assignments at ABC, they called me to New York, and they asked me to anchor the nightly news. Although I have to be correct, it wasn't the nightly news, it was more like the really, really nightly news, because it was broadcast at 2 a.m. But it didn't matter. It was Peter's chair and it was Peter's desk, and I did the only thing that any self-respecting journalist would do when I sat down on that chair. I took a selfie. And the first person that I sent it to was Professor Wald. With one sentence, I might get emotional when I think about this, I'm sorry, but he had a knack for one email reply, like one sentence replies. So I felt that I should do the same to him. So I sent a little note and I said, "Guess where I am right now?" A few hours later, he replied with something that I never forgot. All he said was, "I told you so." I know Professor Wald was deeply proud of his students, and I can't imagine how proud he was of all of his children. What I do know is how proud and how much he loved his wife. See, I know because shortly before I graduated, I wanted to do something special for the man that got me my first job in journalism. And I said, "Professor, I'd like to take you out for dinner." Now, our class thought we were hot stuff, but the truth is, when you're the senior vice president of ABC News, you can eat at any restaurant in this city. How could I compete with that? But I knew I wanted to do something. So I said, "Professor Wald, I'd like to take you out for dinner at the end of the year just to say thank you." And he said, "Mohammed, I'd be honored on one condition." I said, "What's that?" He leaned forward and he said, "We should really invite our wives." As journalists, we try to protect the people that we love from the consequences of our profession, but the truth is we can't do it alone. And he was a living embodiment of that. I remember when we'd be in a meeting and his wife would call and his eyes would light up and he would stop whatever he was doing to take that phone call. And in doing so, he not only taught us about journalism, but he taught me how to be a good husband and how my eyes should light up whenever my wife calls, even if it's 2 minutes before a deadline and there's an editor on my case. The last time I spoke with Professor Wald, he jokingly said, "Mohammed, if you ever become the CEO of a news network one day, I hope you'll get me a cushy consulting gig with a corner office and a really nice view." I wasn't able to become the president of a news network in time to give him a cushy view. But if it's any consolation, Professor Wald, I hope you have a really nice view wherever you are now. And thanks to you, I will never be able to have wonton soup the same way again. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joelle. I have neither produced nor directed a documentary or film. I have not written any articles of import. I've never won any literary awards or contributed to anything thought-provoking or, well, mildly interesting. To Wald, however, I was a, quote, "no good, goddamn ratfink who no one ever loved." And to those of you who know him, you will agree this is the highest honor anyone could strive for. I knew Wald for over 15 years. I began as his student, but then again, we're all his students. I was his assistant for over a decade, and that just meant I was anointed the privilege of spending every week with him. We lunched monthly, emailed weekly, and laughed regularly. He had the discretion of a mafia consigliere for all of my secrets, the sage wisdom and patience of Yoda for any problem despite the gravity, and the loyalty, silliness, and acerbic wit of even my bitchiest of girlfriends. And we all know how much he loved gossip. Whether lunching with Kissinger or taking the time to help an eager J school student, albeit an attractive one, Wald had time for everyone. He loved helping and he loved contributing. He was constantly and actively seeking to learn more. At the age of 80, he decided he was going to, quote, read all the books I have lied about having read over a lifetime of academic prevarication. He was, as we all know, disarmingly humble. After all the years together, I never knew about half of his achievements. He was more excited to tell stories about Edith or his grandkids, life as a lowly reporter when the Berlin Wall came down, or trying to justify his deafness with some convoluted story that started with the Congo and ended with shotguns. While he enjoyed complaining, he hated when anyone worried about him. After he had a stroke, he simply told me there was, quote, no way he could get any better looking or more charming. And after his hip surgery, quote, as you well know, I am better than other people. So it came as something of a surprise when I discovered that it takes me just as long to recover as it takes most other folks. Most people say that a person has made an indelible mark on their lives, but that doesn't cut it for Wald. His impact is not finite, it is evolutionary. There's no end to it. Every day I try my best to think what he would say. Quote, think of it in the opposite. Or he would enumerate reasons why something should be done as he deliberately lowered each finger and itemized the things I got wrong. But he would always say, quote, call a friend. He was that call, that email, that text, my friend. Without Wald, the world seems illogical and without direction. But what do I know? I'm just a no-good bitch who no one loves. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here. My father used to say that one of the best deeds you could do was to go to a memorial service because you knew you did it knowing that the honoree could never reciprocate. So my family is very glad to see all of you here. All of you either worked with my father or took his class. Maybe he was your advisor on your major project. I can't add to that, but I can tell you some things you probably don't know. For example, it may not be clear to you how deeply connected he was to Columbia. Now, this is a grad school audience, but he started out here as an undergraduate. I don't think it was his first choice. He was admitted to Harvard, which one of the few Jews to be admitted to Harvard in the 40s. But his father, my grandfather's business, went bankrupt the year before. So he stayed at home, lived in Bay Ridge, and took the subway here every day. And he became really attached to Columbia. 60 years later, he could recite day by day the lunch menu in the Columbia cafeteria. And it was things like pot roast. It was not anything memorable. Columbia left an imprint on him. He got an education here in the classics, and he believed in the classics. That's why on a lark a few years ago, he volunteered to co-teach a contemporary civilization class with his classmate Max Frankel. I think he'd always wanted to reread, or maybe just read, Herodotus and Plato, and this made him do it. He was on the board of Spec forever and ever. Maybe he just liked getting out of the house and going to the Blue Pencil dinners. After his retirement from ABC News in 1999, he achieved a long-held dream, and that was he got a free parking space here in Manhattan. For those of you who knew him as a Columbia professor, it may not be obvious that his career in journalism spanned an extremely long time. When he was an undergraduate, he interviewed General Dwight Eisenhower then president of Columbia, and later followed Winston Churchill on Churchill's last campaign for Parliament. As a newly minted TV executive in the late 60s, he observed that making a TV cameraman, a TV reporter bring his cameras with him was like making a print reporter bring a linotype machine along. This was a good analogy at the time. There may not be many people in this room who ever saw a working linotype machine. He wasn't nostalgic. After the Herald Tribune went under in 1966, he'd been with the paper starting as a stringer at Columbia for almost 20 years. As a previous speaker said, he didn't say that he left newspapers. He said that newspapers left him. He went into television, and during his tenure at Columbia, it became clear that network television was fading, as newspapers had. He wasn't nostalgic about that either. So for those of you who are journalists, that's a lesson I would draw from him that may not be so obvious. The only constant is change. He understood that, and there are more changes to come. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Wald, and I am Dick Wald's daughter. I live in Colorado, and in case you're wondering, yes, I did bring this weather with me. My dad, all I can say is he was an amazing man. He was an exceptional public speaker, but he somehow had no ego. There aren't many people who are as well-read as he was, but he was never boring. There aren't so many people who traveled the world, but he never bored anybody with the stories of his adventures. You had to ask. And the positions he held in print and media were unbelievably powerful, and yet it was also something he never talked about. He was just an amazing person. I'm here to pay tribute both to him and to Columbia, although I do have a bone to pick with Columbia because when it was time for me to apply to college, Columbia did not accept women, so I had to go to that safety school, Dartmouth. And it's colored my thoughts about Columbia ever since, but what are you going to do? My father could not, in no way, have afforded to come to Columbia if he hadn't been offered an incredible scholarship. And I don't think Columbia knew what they were getting into when they offered that scholarship. He got an unbelievable education in both English and the classics. And then he went on with a scholarship from Columbia to Clare College in Cambridge to pursue a master's degree. He had an endless curious mind, and I don't think he ever would have stopped formal education unless my mother had turned to him one day and said, "Honey, you gotta make a living." And fortunately for all of us, he picked a job that he was not only educated for, but it was uniquely suited for his incredible talents. He started when I knew him as a foreign correspondent for the New York Herald Tribune, and we lived in England. And he loved to travel, so it was perfect. He loved learning about people. And he was just an amazing writer. I have a picture of him from, it didn't make the cut. I did notice that most of the pictures included my brother. It was like I never existed, but I have a picture of me as a 3 or 4-year-old dressed in God knows what hand-me-downs, and my dad is dressed in a top hat and tails, and must be in his mid to late 20s, and he's going to have tea with the Queen. He was so interested in people. This was always fascinating to me. He came out to visit. He loved Colorado, so he was always visiting me, and frankly, sometimes longer than I'd like. And he'd come with my mother, and it was a long trip, so they stayed, and they stayed, and they stayed. But it was as easy for him to talk to the plumber working under the sink as it was for him to, as you saw, shake hands with the Pope and talk to him. When he died, I was in his house for a long time cleaning it out because my mother was a little bit of a pack rat, and the garbage collectors rang the doorbell to say how sad they were that he had passed away. When he had driven the Herald Tribune into the ground, because at the time he was the managing editor, it's hard to place blame in a lot of places, he made the easy transition from print to media. I mean, for a man as smart as he was, that was not a problem, and change was, as somebody else has said, just a fact of life for him. I mean, it was, putting women in television, it was a no-brainer for him. Couldn't get me into Columbia, but, and he loved Colorado. And so, he came so much that one day we just sort of integrated my mother and father into whatever we were doing. And one day we went to a cocktail party at my brother-in-law's house, and somebody asked him what he did. And he said, "I work in television." And the guy goes, "Like sales and service?" And my dad says, "Yes." He just had no ego, and he had no interest in talking about himself. He wanted to talk to other people and learn about other people and make a connection with other people, any people. And when it came time for him to retire from the media, he made the transition to the journalism school with incredible joy. I think he took me and my sons on a tour of Columbia. He was so proud of all the buildings and the ones that were there when he was there and the ones that weren't there when he was there. He was just amazing. And he just loved Columbia. And he put everything he had into teaching journalism. And he taught with passion, giving his students the benefit of his many and incredible years of experience, and his public speaking skills, and his famous friends. And in the last measure of his devotion to Columbia, he gave his youngest son as his adjunct professor. He definitely owed Columbia a debt, but Columbia owes him too. I'm sorry. I'd say they were even. But as his biased daughter, I think Columbia came out on top, and that's just the way he would have wanted it.
I didn't think I was going to get this emotional. My name is Jonathan Wald, and he got me into Columbia. I don't know what the problem was. I also had the incredible honor and pleasure of being his adjunct in a blatant act of nepotism before there was even a term Nepo babies. He had helped me begin and end my academic career as his adjunct, which was a great thing to be able to do. And John Martin, he loved you, and he would have been mad at us if we hadn't invited you to this. So I'm glad you were able to come. I want to thank Dean Cobb, the Alumni Relations Director, Kellyanne Spencer, former student Lauren Mack, without whom this evening would not be possible, and her classmate Rebecca Castillo, who worked magic on that video. I mean, they made this happen. We thought it would be a nice idea to have a memorial up here after he died, and then forgot about it, as he would expect, and they made it happen, so I give them all the credit. I do think it's fitting we're gathering to honor the professor, as I always called him, with the campus on lockdown. He always loved being in the middle of the action, whether it was revolution in the Congo or upheaval in the NBC boardroom in the 70s. Same idea. One note on the professor's deep connection with Columbia that my brother mentioned. One of the things he learned here, as was also in the video, as he often put it, the way you think about something is almost as important as what you think about that something. A good example is what must have been his proudest moment as an undergrad toiling in the classroom of legendary Lionel Trilling, professor here, who graded one of his papers A over F. "What does this mean?" my father asked Trilling after class. "You are a brilliant writer," Trilling responded, "so you get an A, but I have no idea what you are saying, so you get an F." He loved telling that story up here, where I think we both felt like we always owed a paper when we walked on College Walk, which, as my brother also pointed out, he's the only man alive I ever knew to be able to park there. I don't know how he did that. The garbage people liked him. They let him park there whenever he wanted. I'd be in school, and I'd walk out and I'd see his car. Crazy. One other thing you may have noticed in the tape was a reference to his uncanny, or in his case, he would probably say canny, prediction about the future of television news well before Ted Turner created CNN. In March of 1976, he addressed the National Association of Broadcasters at their annual meeting in Chicago. We don't have a copy of his speech because he did not write one. He was not scheduled to speak. He filled in for David Brinkley, who couldn't make it. What we do have is a transcript of his remarks, which were delivered off the cuff, as I read this, and oddly more organized than most of those prepared for the event. "The future isn't what it used to be," he said, quoting Yale history professor Carl Deutsch. Deutsch said his research started in 1300, and in those days, the future looked very much like the past, or just a little bit more of the same, until you got to the Renaissance, when the future really started to look different. That day in Chicago, the president of NBC News noted the technology was changing so quickly that if you wanted to, although God knows why you might, he said, you could soon go to the bottom of the Grand Canyon and broadcast a live program by getting a Jeep down there if you could. That's pretty impressive, he said. That meant there'd be more live pictures on the air. Television, he said, would likely follow radio, where in order to survive, stations had to individuate. They had to do that through a total format. Quote, "I would bet, owing to the technology with which we are faced, within 10 years, there will be an all-news television station." This was 1976, by the way. "There's no reason why there shouldn't be. We could produce that much picture, that much of the time, with not a huge investment. Also very soon," he said, "we might do all news all night on television. No reason why not. But what would this all-news channel have on it?" He had an answer. "The world is too complicated for general assignment reporters to comprehend, and therefore there will be more experts on the air, period. The experts will not necessarily be drawn from the academic ranks. They may be reporters who become expert, but we will need, in order to report the news of the future, people who are competent to deal with experts on their own level. We will develop them. The anchors will be different too, not all-knowing mouths, as he called them, who never really existed, but more questioning anchors who will be surrogates for us, trying to explain events as they best can and how they affect us. Quote, "I think the news we put on these programs will become more people-oriented. I think that all of television is going to move a little bit more toward reality programming." Again, 1976. partly because people are smarter than they used to be, and partly because romance doesn't play as well as it used to. Then he predicted news would keep being a contested center, even more so. That is, as its importance grows, and there's more of it, he said, more worth fighting over and fighting to shape, own, push, and prod. I believe that will involve all of us here and all of our successors in a series of arguments that will be never ending. If it's worth fighting for, people will fight for it. I am telling you, he concluded, that television news is worth fighting for, and therefore there will be a great deal of pressure to mold it, shape it, to the will of those who would want to use it as a conscious instrument of social control. So, he predicted CNN and Fox News. And here's his conclusion. It is up to the news people and up to the management to see to it that the news not only is a service, but also is seen to be a service to the population, because then the inroads on the news will be seen to be inroads on their service, and in that lies our best safeguard. He got a lot of that right, and he shared that with the students here, which is why we are all here today. And I think that if there's one thing that we should remember him for is, as my sisters put it, and everybody has put it today, how smart he was and how he saw what was coming and wasn't really afraid of it. And that was the real lesson he left all of us. And thank you all for coming.
So thank you all for coming out, and I'm particularly happy that I get to meet Tom Goldstein, whom I'd never met as another dean. I'd heard rumors that there was a secret handshake that just among deans, but nobody's ever taught it to me, so maybe you can figure it out after. I'm told that Professor Wald would end his national affairs class each year with a champagne toast. And so in his honor, we will do the same this evening. And so if you'll please join me in raising a glass to Professor Dick Wald, a brilliant mind, a dedicated teacher, and a man who made a lasting impact on us all. Cheers. Thank you. This concludes our program.